Welcome to the Warriors of the World channel. Today, we will cover a topic of extreme intensity, a story that touches the emotional and psychological depths of anyone attempting to understand the horrors of war. Here are the Kamikazes. These Japanese pilots, during World War II, made the most extreme decision a soldier can make. They sacrificed their lives in one-way attacks, crashing into enemy ships with great precision. But who were these warriors? What drove them to commit such acts of self-sacrifice? And how did this tactic impact the course of the war and shape Japan's historical memory and the world's? Get ready for a journey that will not only explore the military tactics of these pilots but also delve deeply into their motivations, the cultural weight they carried, and the consequences of their actions. We will fly with the Kamikazes on their final flight, explore their minds, and understand why they were called divine winds. Are you ready for this journey? Then buckle up and come with us. Before diving directly into the Kamikazes, we need to step back in time a bit and understand how Japan reached such an extreme point. During the 1930s, Japan embarked on an ambitious plan of imperial expansion, conquering territories in Asia and the Pacific. They saw this expansion as vital to ensuring their economic and military survival, especially since Japan was an island nation with limited resources. In 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor marked the beginning of direct conflict between Japan and the United States. Initially, Japan seemed unbeatable. Its naval and air forces dominated vast areas of the Pacific, and the nation's morale was sky-high. However, modern war is a game of endurance, and Japan quickly found itself depleted of resources, while the United States, with its powerful industry, was just getting started. After the decisive Battle of Midway in 1942, Japanese forces began losing ground, and the war became a series of strategic retreats and desperate battles to maintain what was left of their empire. By late 1944, the situation was grim. The invasion of the Philippines and the retaking of Guam marked the beginning of a steady Allied advance toward the Japanese home islands. It was in this atmosphere of absolute desperation that Japanese military leaders conceived the idea of the Kamikazes. Japan no longer had the resources to face the powerful American fleet head-on. Their factories were in ruins, fuel supplies were nearly exhausted, and their best pilots had died in combat. The country needed a tactic capable of quickly and effectively stopping the Allied advance. The name kamikaze, meaning divine wind, dates back to a 13th century legend when typhoons, called kamikaze, supposedly saved Japan from 2 Mongol invasion attempts. These divine winds were said to have sunk the invading fleet and protected the Japanese nation. During World War II, Japanese military leaders revisited this mythic story and used the name kamikaze to give meaning to a new war tactic, attacks from which the pilot had no intention of returning. The kamikaze idea was formally introduced by Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi in October 1944. Onishi was a brilliant strategist who saw no-return attacks as a way to maximize the impact of their already weakened air forces. He believed that by sending planes loaded with explosives directly into enemy ships, they could cause far more damage than usual. The concept of using attacks where the pilots' lives were cruelly discarded wasn't entirely new. During the war, there had been instances of Japanese soldiers, when seeing no way out, opting to end their own lives in a final attack against the enemy, often carrying explosives or charging with bayonets directly into enemy lines. But what set the kamikazes apart was the institutionalization of this sacrifice. These weren't isolated acts of desperation, but a planned and coordinated military strategy. With the decision to create kamikaze units, Japan began recruiting pilots for these missions. But how could someone be convinced to embark on a mission that guaranteed their own death? This is where Japanese culture, deeply rooted in concepts of honor and loyalty, comes into play. In Japan, loyalty to the emperor and the country was instilled from an early age in schools and universities. The emperor was seen as a divine figure, and dying for him was considered the pinnacle of loyalty. Moreover, Bushido, the supposed code of conduct for samurai, still resonated strongly in Japanese society. Bushido taught that honor was more important than life, and perishing in battle was one of the noblest ways to leave this world. Many of the young men who volunteered for kamikaze units were university students who saw in this mission an opportunity to serve their country in a time of extreme need. Some volunteered willingly, driven by a deep sense of duty, while others were pressured to volunteer, fearing the dishonor that would fall upon them and their families if they didn't. Once selected, These young men were sent to training camps where they underwent a brief but intense preparation. The training included not only basic piloting skills but also psychological conditioning. They were constantly reminded that their mission was sacred and that by destroying themselves in an attack, they were ensuring the survival of their homeland and bringing honor to their families. It was a form of indoctrination, where the fear of the afterlife was suppressed by a sense of duty. The training of the kamikazes was, without a doubt, a physically and emotionally exhausting experience. For many of these young men, the first time they took off in a plane would also be their last. The training itself was rudimentary. Since the goal was to collide with the target, the kamikazes didn't need to master the complex aerial maneuvers required in combat. The focus was on ensuring they could take off, fly straight toward the target, and when close enough, enter a high-speed dive to maximize the impact. The planes used in kamikaze attacks were often older models, such as the Mitsubishi A6M0, which was already outdated in terms of combat technology. The Zero was a fast and agile fighter, but its armor was weak, and its ability to withstand damage was limited. For the kamikazes, this didn't matter, as the plane itself was merely a means to an end. Many kamikaze planes were modified to carry additional explosives, turning them into true human missiles. During training, the kamikazes were subjected to an intense symbolic and emotional load through harsh conditioning. They were constantly reminded of their divine mission and the honor they would bring to Japan by leaving this world to dwell in the realm of the gods alongside their ancestors. Photos and letters left by kamikazes reveal young men who, although aware of the sacrifice they were about to make, often expressed feelings of sadness, homesickness, and even doubt about their mission. In one of the most famous letters left by a kamikaze, the young pilot Yasuo Kuwahara wrote, "Today is my last day on Earth. I do not fear death, for my spirit will live on forever in Japan, but I think of my mother and the tears she will shed. I hope that when this war ends, the winds will bring peace." These words show that behind the image of relentless warriors were young men filled with emotions, fears, and hopes, crushed by the brutal reality of their culture and government. The first kamikaze attack occurred during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, in the Philippines. It was an action that shocked the Allied forces. No one expected the Japanese to resort to such extreme tactics. The idea of planes on a suicide trajectory, deliberately crashing into enemy ships, was something unprecedented in modern warfare. But this was just the first of many missions in which Japanese pilots would take their own lives. The tactic was relatively simple. Kamikazes would fly in groups, and as they neared the enemy fleet, they would attempt to evade anti-aircraft defenses. Often, the first wave of kamikazes acted as decoys, drawing fire from the ships while the subsequent waves closed in and dove at high speed toward their targets. The goal was to hit high-value ships like aircraft carriers and cruisers, causing maximum destruction in a mission with no return. Kamikaze attacks were not only devastating in terms of material damage, but also had a powerful psychological effect. The crews of the Allied ships knew they were facing an enemy unafraid of being shot down. The kamikazes came with unwavering determination, ignoring anti-aircraft fire, and in many cases, even diving toward the ships in flames after being hit. In one instance, a kamikaze pilot, despite his severely damaged plane, managed to maintain control long enough to crash directly into the USS St. Lo, an escort carrier. The resulting explosion was so powerful that the ship sank in less than an hour. Cases like this repeated throughout the Pacific War, and the kamikazes became one of the main threats faced by the United States Navy. From the Allies' perspective, kamikaze attacks were terrifying, to say the least. Until then, air warfare had followed certain implicit rules, where pilots sought victory but also, when possible, avoided unnecessary self-sacrifice. With the kamikazes, this logic was completely overturned. The suicide pilots weren't interested in surviving, and this element made their tactics particularly difficult to counter. The U.S. Navy, in particular, suffered from kamikaze attacks, especially during the Battle of Okinawa, from April to June 1945. This battle was one of the most intense in the Pacific theater and saw massive use of kamikaze attacks. Over 1,500 suicide missions were launched during the Okinawa campaign, inflicting significant damage on American forces. To combat the kamikazes, the Americans had to adapt their tactics. One response was to reinforce the anti-aircraft defenses of their ships, increasing the number of machine guns and anti-aircraft cannons. The ships also began to sail in more dispersed formations to minimize the impact of a successful kamikaze attack. Additionally, escort fighters were assigned to intercept the kamikazes before they could approach the fleets. Despite these measures, the kamikazes continued to wreak significant havoc. During the Battle of Okinawa, dozens of Allied ships were sunk or damaged, and thousands of sailors lost their lives. However, while the kamikazes inflicted great losses, they couldn't stop the Allied advance. The Americans continued to push toward Japan, and the war was rapidly approaching Japanese territory. To truly understand the kamikazes, we must look beyond their tactics and military outcomes. What was going through the minds of these young pilots as they prepared for the ultimate sacrifice? There is a tendency to view the kamikazes as fanatics, blindly willing to sacrifice themselves for their country. But the reality is far more complex. Many kamikazes were intelligent young men, promising students who had been recruited directly from universities. They had dreams and ambitions, but they were dragged into a war that was beyond their control. The letters and diaries left by kamikazes reveal a mixture of emotions. On one hand, there was pride in serving their country and, in many cases, a resigned acceptance of their fate. On the other hand, there was a deep fear of death and overwhelming sadness at leaving their families and friends behind. One of the most poignant stories comes from Yukio Araki, the youngest known kamikaze pilot, who died at the age of 17. Before departing on his mission, he took a photo with his squadron mates, holding a puppy. The image is both touching and unsettling, showing the human side of these young men, who were still, in many ways, children. Araki, like many other kamikazes, wrote a letter to his family in which he expressed his hope that his death would not be in vain and that Japan could find peace, sharing the same feelings expressed in Yasuo Kuwahara's letter. Another interesting aspect of the kamikaze psychology was the fact that many of them performed rituals before departing on their missions. They would wear hachimaki headbands, traditionally worn by samurai warriors, and often prayed or meditated before takeoff. These rituals helped to strengthen their resolve and prepare their minds for the sacrifice they were about to make. While many kamikazes accepted their missions with a sense of duty, not all were ready or willing to sacrifice themselves. There are accounts of pilots who, at the last moment, hesitated or attempted to abort their missions on their own. Some simply couldn't bring themselves to collide with enemy ships and return to their bases. These returns were seen as shameful, and the pilots who failed in their missions faced the dishonor of their peers and superiors. The kamikaze survivors, those who for whatever reason failed to complete their missions, often faced a life of psychological suffering. Many were ostracized, while others spent years dealing with the guilt and trauma of not having fulfilled their duty. The social pressure on young Japanese men during the war was overwhelming. Refusing a kamikaze mission wasn't a simple option. Not only was the pilot's life at stake, but so was the honor of his family. In a culture where public dishonor was an indelible mark, many young men felt they had no choice but to sacrifice themselves, even though their hearts were full of doubt and dread. These stories are rarely told, but they show us that while the kamikazes are often portrayed as extreme examples of patriotism, they were also victims of a militaristic system that exploited the personal vulnerabilities of an entire society and manipulated it emotionally in every way possible. The Bushido, the supposed ancient code of the samurai, had always been revered in Japan as an ideal of warrior behavior. It exalted honor, loyalty, and personal sacrifice for a greater cause. However, during World War II, Bushido was distorted and manipulated by the Japanese government to justify extreme acts of sacrifice, such as kamikaze attacks, much like the German government did with the writings of Friedrich Nietzsche. Japanese military propaganda portrayed the kamikazes as the modern heirs of the samurai. Bushido, which traditionally emphasized righteousness and compassion, was reduced to a simple concept of blind sacrifice for the emperor. Dying in battle became not only a way to preserve honor but the only acceptable path for soldiers facing imminent defeat. This distorted use of Bushido helped create a culture of sacrifice that pushed thousands of young men into an early grave. While many kamikazes genuinely believed they were following the samurai code, what they were actually doing was performing a perverted and dehumanized version of it. In addition to the kamikaze planes, Japan also developed a submarine version of the sacrificial tactic, known as kaiten. These were essentially manned torpedoes, where a soldier would enter a small submarine loaded with explosives, with the mission of directly colliding with enemy ships. The kaitens were a desperate weapon, developed late in the war when Japan was running out of options. Like the kamikaze pilots, Kaiten pilots knew their missions were one way. The difference was that instead of flying through the sky, they launched themselves into the sea, speeding toward enemy ships at incredible speeds. Although the Kaitens had less impact than the aerial kamikazes, they also posed a significant threat to the U.S. Navy. Kaiten submariners faced incredibly dangerous conditions, with limited space and almost no control over their torpedoes once launched. The sacrifice of these pilots was equally tragic, and many never came close to their targets, being destroyed by enemy fire or lost at sea. The Battle of Okinawa, which took place from April to June 1945, was the pinnacle of the kamikaze strategy. Known as the largest amphibious operation in the Pacific War, this battle was one of the last major confrontations before Japan's surrender. The American forces knew that Okinawa would be crucial for the final invasion of Japan, and the Japanese defenses were prepared to fight to the last man. Okinawa was the site of one of the most intense kamikaze campaigns. More than 1,500 of these suicide attacks were launched against the American fleet, causing enormous damage and leading to the loss of dozens of ships. American forces faced fierce resistance not only from the kamikazes but also from Japanese soldiers on land, who fought to the death in caves and underground fortifications. For the Japanese, Okinawa represented the last stronghold before the invasion of the main islands, and they were willing to sacrifice everything to prevent the Allied advance. Although the kamikazes caused significant destruction, the numerical and technological superiority of the Americans ultimately prevailed, and the island was captured after one of the bloodiest battles of the war. The Battle of Okinawa also marked the effective end of the kamikaze air force, which had been decimated by the fighting. With Japan's resources stretched to the limit and its military forces nearly destroyed, the country was nearing total collapse. With the fall of Okinawa and the destruction of the last kamikaze forces, Japan was on the brink of total defeat. However, even at this desperate moment, there were factions within the Japanese government that insisted on fighting to the end. They believed that if Japan could inflict more losses on the Allies, the terms of surrender might be more favorable. It was in this context that the United States made the decision to drop atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. The devastation caused by these weapons was unimaginable, and the psychological impact on Japan was profound. The idea of fighting to the death, which had been the foundation of the kamikaze strategy, suddenly became irrelevant in the face of the new reality of nuclear destruction. Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, marked the official end of the kamikaze missions and the Japanese war effort. The country was forced to confront the consequences of a war that had destroyed its cities, its armed forces, and, in many cases, the spirit of its youth. After the war, many of the surviving kamikazes faced a deep personal dilemma. They had been trained to end their own lives, but for various reasons, they survived. Some pilots returned to their families after being shot down or failing in their missions. For these men, the return to civilian life was painful. In a devastated Japan, they were not seen as heroes. Instead, many were ignored or worse, treated with disdain. The sacrifice of the kamikazes had been glorified during the war, but after defeat, the country quickly sought to bury this painful memory. For many of these pilots, the post-war period was one of isolation and psychological trauma. Some of them ultimately took their own lives, unable to live with the weight of their perceived failures or the dishonor they believed they carried. However, the personal legacy of the kamikazes also survived in other ways. Letters, diaries, and artifacts left behind by these pilots offer an intimate window into their minds and hearts. Many of these documents reveal young men who weren't ready to die but who felt they had no other choice. They show the human side of a war often remembered only for its numbers and strategies. The Chiran Peace Museum in Japan is one place where the memory of the kamikazes is preserved. There, visitors can see the last letters, photos, and belongings of the young pilots who departed on their one-way missions. The museum not only honors these young men but also serves as a reminder of the horrors of militarism and war. The story of the kamikazes left a deep mark on popular culture, not only in Japan but around the world. Films, games, and books have explored the complexity of this tactic and the sacrifice of its pilots. Movies like Tora depict the rise of Japan's self-sacrificial mentality and how it culminated in the kamikazes, while other productions, such as the documentary The Last Kamikaze, testimonies of survivors, offer a more intimate look at the psychological and emotional impact of these missions. In video games, kamikazes frequently appear as a formidable threat in war games set in the Pacific, like Call of Duty, World at War, and Battlefield 5. These games not only portray the kamikazes as relentless enemies, but also capture the terror and psychological impact they had on Allied forces. In literature, works like Kamikaze Diaries by Emiko Onuki Tierney delve deeply into the psychology of kamikaze pilots, exploring their letters and diaries in an effort to understand what led them to accept their deadly missions. Other books, like The Divine Wind by Rikihei Inaguchi and Tadashi Nakajima, offer a perspective from the commanders who led the kamikaze units and how these missions were organized. Moreover, post-war Japan has also reflected on the kamikazes in its cultural productions. While the early post-war years were marked by an attempt to forget the sacrifice of these young men, in the following decades, a historical re-evaluation brought the topic of the kamikazes back as a symbol of a lost youth. Japanese films and anime often tackle themes of sacrifice, loyalty, and honor, reflecting the lasting impact kamikaze missions had on the national psyche. Thus, we come to the end of this extensive journey about the kamikazes. The story of these young pilots willing to take their own lives in the name of honor is undoubtedly one of the most intense and complex themes of World War II. They were heroes, victims, and symbols of a war that pushed Japan to the extreme of its endurance. Today, the kamikazes are remembered in different ways across the world. For some, they were warriors who gave their lives for their country in a time of desperate need. For others, they were young men exploited by a militaristic system that emotionally manipulated them, leading them to a cruel and unnecessary sacrifice. However, one thing is certain: the kamikazes left a profound legacy, not only in Japan but across the world. They remind us of the horrors of war, the cost of extremism, and the complexity of human sacrifice. As we reflect on their actions, we must also remember the lessons their lives and deaths teach us. And now, a question for you. How do you see the kamikazes? Were they tragic heroes or victims of a war that forced them to choose between life and honor? Share your opinion in the comments, and let's continue this discussion. If you enjoyed this journey through the world of the kamikazes, subscribe to the Warriors of the World channel for more incredible stories about warriors who shaped our history, and see you in the next episode here on our channel.